Okay, hi everyone. It's great to see you all. Welcome to this Policy and Practice seminar hosted by the UCL Department of Political Science and the School of Public Policy. My name is Aparna Ravi. I'm a lecturer here in the department. I work on international political economy and emerging markets, and I'm your chair for this evening. So the topic for tonight's event is Indian politics after the 2024 election. So I'm sure, as all of you know, India took the polls recently this year. The BJP did win the election, win a majority, but it was quite a surprise. They didn't win as many seats as they were expecting, and so it fell very short of expectations. So here we have tonight to kind of analyze the election results and what they mean for the trajectory of the country. So I'll just introduce the speakers in the order in which they'll be giving their comments, so we look forward to their comments, and then also the Q&A afterward. So Dr. Pavithra Suryanarayan is an associate professor at the Department of Government in the London School of Economics. Her work focuses on state capacity, redistributive politics, and vote choice in ranked ethnic systems like India and the United States. And she also focuses on party organization and party system institutionalization in the Indian states. And Dr. James Chiriyankandath is the senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. He's an expert on Indian politics, especially on elections, nationalism, and the politics of communalism and religious identity. And he's recently co-authored a book on the politics of poverty reduction in India, the UPA government, from 2004 to 2014. And then finally, Dr. Kshitij Bajpai is the Senior Research Fellow for South Asia at the Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House. Prior to his current role, he was Political Risk Advisor for Asia for various companies' institutions, and has also worked at the Center for Strategic Studies and International Studies and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. So just a quick note, the event format. So each speaker will offer opening remarks for about 5 to 7 minutes. Then we'll have a quick panel discussion, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A for about 30 minutes. And just a quick note on the recording details. So the whole session will be recorded and will be posted online on the department's website and our YouTube channel and our podcast after the event. So if you speak, you'll be heard in the recording. If you don't speak, you'll not be heard. And we'll let you know when the recording is available, and hopefully you'll be able to view it and then share it widely. All right, so that's all, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Suryanarayan.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I mean, for those of us who are political scientists, with this year of elections, I feel 2024 has been going on for 20 years. Because, you know, we had South African elections, Indian elections, and then the British elections, and now the American elections are upon us. And each of these, I think, is really teaching us something very interesting about political behavior across the planet at a time of rising populism. I was in India in April during the voting phase of the Indian elections, April and May, because this was done over 7 phases as about, the world's largest democracy went to the polls. And going into the elections, the BJP really looked all-powerful, right? It seemed to control all the money and the muscle in Indian politics, and the opposition had been either bullied or made bankrupt by various tactics. And yet we saw this very exciting, surprising set of results play out. And, in some ways, the election results harken back to a time of Indian politics that was through the 1980s, 1990s, and the first decade of this century, because it harkened back to a time of coalitional politics where, politics really played out state by state in India. Who the party's partners were, what the issue was, really seemed to go back to reflecting a form of federal coalitional politics, which we haven't seen in the past decade, right? The second thing that this hearkened to was, the limits of Prime Minister Modi's economics, right? Going in the West, we heard a lot about India's growth being awesome, poverty alleviation being awesome, but being in the field in April made it sort of clear to us that rural distress was really playing out across India, particularly in the BJP's own heartland of places like Uttar Pradesh and Haryana, which turned out to be the biggest surprises of this election, right? And the third was the return of a somewhat surprisingly organized and strategic opposition, India is what we call a first past the post system. And what does that mean? It's winner take all. Whoever wins the largest number of votes in a particular constituency gets the seat. There's no consolation prize. It's like the British system here. And a fragmented opposition can really cost you when you are going up against an incumbent. And here the opposition really seemed to have gotten its game together by coordinating in advance and really focused on a message of rural distress and economic inequality and social justice. And that really brings me to the point I want to make today, which is the return front and center of caste politics in India as articulated by the opposition led by the Congress. What do I mean by this? It was for the first time that we saw very clear demands for a caste census that could tell us how many groups or jatis, which are the subcastes of India, even exist at the local level, what are their numbers, and what do they have in terms of their material location within the country. And why was this such a powerful message? Because it tied inequality, redistributive demands, and caste together as a bundle so that the opposition could really distinguish itself against the BJP, which it portrayed to be the party of the wealthy, the upper caste, the haves, and excluding have-nots from the fruits of progress over the past decade. And this message really resonated because, this is part of my research, which is to try and understand the role of caste-based inequality in India and how it motivates voting behavior. So I have some work on this, which has shown how, caste as an identity is much more powerful in politics when there is genuine class differences between caste groups across space and time, right? And so states where castes are really distinguishable from each other in terms of their economic location have more caste-based voting. States where this inequality is much weaker have less caste-based voting. And so here, I think what the Congress did very effectively was to go into the places where the BJP had come to power, riding a wave of Hindutva, Hindu majoritarian politics to say, actually, there's a tremendous amount of inequality within the Hindu umbrella, and we really need to introspect on whether you're better off or worse off when that equation is being made. And I think that message sort of broke through. Now, whether that's going to lead to a permanent form of redistributive politics built around caste as a counter to the communalism of Hindu, non-Hindu dynamics in India, well, we will wait and see. We have had state elections since, most notably in the state of Haryana recently, where again, the BJP seems to have made gains after losing the national elections, quite vividly. And so, we are yet to see whether there's an antidote to communal politics in India, which will take the form of caste politics. And that's my comments for this.
Perfect on time. Thank you. And then, James?
Yeah. Thank you. Now, in my introductory remarks, I would like to touch on three ways in which the BJP and other organizations in the so-called family of Hindutva organizations, the Sangh Parivar, that come under the aegis of the parent body, the RSS, or the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, how they have changed Indian politics since the 1980s. First, through the transformation of the language of political rhetoric and discourse, how people talk politics. And beyond this, in what I would say has become widely accepted as the common sense of the Indian public. And as an Indian who has been traveling back and forth from India for the last 60 years, so being there a few months every year, I get a snapshot of how things change over time. Second, I'm going to speak about how the generation of a cultural and social ecosystem has sustained this transformation and helped foster the rise of the BJP into the most powerful political party in the country. And lastly, and this has just been referred to obliquely by the previous speaker, the adept use by the BJP in power of agencies of state power, as well as the judiciary, big business, and the media, to emasculate its political opponents. So let me start with transforming the idea of India. The RSS's purpose, articulated from the beginning, has been the cultural and spiritual regeneration of Hindus, reforming the myriad traditions which we now call Hinduism into a singular ethno-religious identity, which would be the basis for a national identity and a united India, an Akhand Bharat. It was founded in 1925. It will celebrate its 100th anniversary next September. There were the founder, K.B. Hedgewar, was a congressman originally, briefly, but disillusioned by Gandhian politics, left Congress, and like three of his four successors, was a Marathi Brahmin, as is the current head of the RSS, the Mohan Bhagwat. Until independence and up to the 1980s, the RSS, the Hindu Mahasabha, another Hindutva organization, and their post-independence political offshoots, the Jan Sangh First and the Bharatiya Janata Party, were usually termed communal groups, and their politics were described by political commentators as communal, just as that of the pre-independence Muslim League that created Pakistan was called communal. However, since then, there has been a change of language. So in the last 30 years, while I've been teaching Indian politics, the term communal politics has fallen into disuse. Instead, we refer to Hindu nationalism. And this is a reflection of the success of the RSS and its associated organizations in affecting the lexicon of politics. And this is you can see this in changing representations of India's past, the revision of history textbooks, a changed national pantheon, so you discard Nehru, you appropriate Sardar Patel, Nehru's deputy prime minister from Gujarat, who was seen as more amenable to the agenda that the RSS espoused, and also affecting the visible public realm. So Allahabad in Uttar Pradesh, one of the biggest cities in India's biggest state, has been renamed Prayagraj. Aurangabad in Maharashtra is now Chhatrapati Sambhaji Nagar. In New Delhi, if you go to New Delhi, you will see the Central Vista project, a huge project that's transforming the urban architecture to encapsulate the envisioning of this new India. And a lot of this has had to be accepted because of the change in language, the change in public consciousness by many of the opposition parties. So the reflexive attitudes introduced by the Sangh Parivar in public life, the ubiquity of pujas, other religious ceremonies, and attendance at functions attended by state officials and so on, has become the norm. Now I turn briefly to the Hindu ecosystem. The Sangh Parivar is based on the RSS, the parent organization, which has 70,000 plus shakas, which you can't say how many members there are, but they number in several millions. And there are many associated organizations, student bodies, labor organizations, as well as religious organizations that have a reach globally, like the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the World Council of Hindus. And these all have helped transform popular religiosity in India from thick to thin religion as badge, flag, and easy ritual, more than faith, spirituality, and the hard ritual. But this has limits, and that is it's limited by regional language and caste. Finally, the appropriated state is that the institutions of state, like the tax authorities, the investigation authorities, the Supreme Court, judicial appointments, these have all been used to hamstring political opponents. So I would conclude by saying that even if the BJP loses power at the national level at some point, the powerful impact that Hindutva has had on national life in changing the way in which Indians imagine their past and themselves and conceive their identity will not disappear. This influence varies by region and social group. However, when and how Modi and the post-BJP, post-Modi lose power will matter. Without a wider context of sustained social and cultural movements paralleling political change, it is hard to see the majoritarian predispositions and ways of seeing India from within that Indians have become used to disappearing.
Great, thank you so much. And then,
So I'll be looking at the election from a very different lens, and that is the foreign policy lens. So I think the impact of the election in terms of India's foreign policy making is generally quite limited. Despite the fact that the BJP has become more beholden to its coalition partners, we need to remember that this is still a very strong coalition government. The BJP holds 240 of the 292 seats within the ruling coalition, and we've seen that translate into, in terms of cabinet appointments, most of the key cabinet positions remain unchanged. If you look at the Cabinet Committee on Security, which is comprised of the Defense Minister, Finance Minister, External Affairs Minister, Home Minister, and the Prime Minister, all these positions are essentially the same. Historically, coalition partners, their role on foreign policy tends to be more as a spoiler. A good example of this is what happened in 2008, when we saw the left front essentially call for a vote of no confidence in the then Congress-led government over its opposition to the US-India nuclear agreement. But frankly, I don't see any of the major parties within the ruling coalition having such a strong ideological stance on issues of foreign policy. I think there are two key caveats to this, one short-term and one longer-term. I think the short-term caveat is ahead of the election, there were some expectations that a third-term Modi government that came to power on a strengthened mandate would try to de-escalate tensions with China. Modi and Jaishankar had made several statements along these lines. But I think that appears less likely now. I mean, the opposition was already critical of the Modi government's approach towards China in the aftermath of the Galwan Valley border clashes that we saw in 2020. And I think the Modi government, the current government, will be even more sensitive to appearing weak on China. So we have seen some limited disengagement along the border, but that's not the same as de-escalation. So we need to make that, or de-escalation of tension. So that, I think, that distinction needs to be made. And then I think a longer-term issue that we need to keep in mind is the election has renewed or added further fuel to the discussion on succession within the BJP. What happens post-Modi? As mentioned, we've just seen the Haryana state election where the BJP was re-elected for a third consecutive term. So I think it's too soon to write off Modi or the BJP at this point. But on the succession debate, several names have been put out there, but I frankly think at this point they lack what I would call the Modi factor, so his level of mass appeal. That, combined with the fact that I think most of these candidates lack Modi's sort of interest in and experience in foreign policy issues. And so Modi, even before he became Prime Minister, when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, held quite a cosmopolitan and global outlook, which most of his potential successors lack. So I think in that context, there's a possibility that when we reach that situation where Modi is not standing for another term, that you could have a situation in which, A, we revert back to the era of Indian politics that existed pre-2014. So for 2.5 decades, this era of anti-incumbency and weak coalition governments, often weak coalition governments. We are already in an era of coalition government politics. But the other aspect of that is that you could see the BJP revert back to its economic, nationalist, and more insular roots. So you could have a less activist foreign policy or less muscular or assertive foreign policy that we've seen under the Modi government in the last 2 terms. If I just briefly then mention what I see to be the key foreign policy priorities of a third-term Modi government, I think first and foremost is to create a more enabling environment for foreign investment. One of the points that was noted in the BJP's election manifesto was to transform India into a trusted global manufacturing hub. Now, this is much easier said than done. The government has come out with several policies on this front, but manufacturing as a share of GDP is still about 17, 18%. Over 40% of the labor force is employed in agriculture, which only contributes 15% of the country's GDP. So while India has potentially emerged as the world's back office and front office, it still has a long way to go in emerging as the world's workshop or factory of the world. I think that is going to be, and also I think in the aftermath of the election, where one of the key issues was concerns about rising youth unemployment, rising inequality, I think the government will also sort of double down on this focus on economic issues, or sort of the economic domain. So, and I think a lot of its diplomatic initiatives will be focused on trying to strengthen the economy. That is, I think, one priority. The second one, which I will note, is the government's continued focus on raising India's status on the world stage. So whether that be being a voice of the global south, which we saw during its G20 presidency, where it facilitated the entry of the African Union into the G20, or this attempt to offer so-called Indian solutions to global problems, so whether it be digital public infrastructure or global health or climate, or whether it be this attempt to try and project India as a so-called Vishwamitra, or a friend of the world. This idea that India can play a role of a bridge between the West and the rest, which we've seen, for example, with Modi's visit to Russia and Ukraine in quick succession. So I think that will be a second priority. And the third and last one issue that I'll mention is that is a renewed engagement or a renewed focus on the neighborhood. So when Modi government assumed power in 2014, it articulated something called the Neighborhood First policy. But increasingly, when we talk about India, we seem to talk more about its global aspirations, its space program, its G20 presidency, and the neighborhood seems to have fallen off the radar to a degree. But I think the implications, or what we saw a few months ago, when what was arguably the most India-friendly government in South Asia, in Bangladesh, was overthrown, I think has raised a fundamental question. And that is, can India rise without the region? Can it rise when three of its neighbors are in the midst of IMF bailouts, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka? We could potentially add a fourth, Maldives, if it defaults on its sovereign debt. Can it rise when it has two countries in its vicinity which are failed or near failed states? I'm referring here to Myanmar and Afghanistan. And can it rise when it has two countries with which it has active border disputes and a history of difficult relations that also happen to be nuclear weapon states? Of course, referring to Pakistan and China. And I would argue not. So I think there's going to be a renewed focus on the neighborhood policy. I can elaborate on that in the Q&A. But let me stop there. Obviously happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate the comments. Okay, so we'll pivot to Q&A. Maybe if I could just have used my position and ask a quick question. So I think one theme was sort of this economic growth, and I think I think what you all have pointed out too, on paper it looks very good, but there's a lot of kind of inequality on the ground. So I guess what I wanted to ask, so I think one big thing, so India has this huge demographic dividend, like a lot of economists have talked about its young population, and it can be, it's basically in the opposite position of many of these other countries that are dealing with low fertility rates and an aging population. And so I was kind of wondering, I think the Modi government has done a lot in terms of infrastructure push and this emphasis on economic growth, but clearly there's this huge issue of jobless growth and a number of people that aren't included in this growth story. So I was just curious, as your perspective, like, do you think that given the election results, the BJP will kind of pivot on its economic policies, and maybe what would Congress's position be in terms of stimulating kind of economic growth on this issue? So yeah, just kind of curious to hear your thoughts on that.
So, I'm actually a fan of coalitional politics in India because I think it produced a lot of really good ideas in the early 2000s under Manmohan Singh, which led to a much more credible period of durable growth and a slightly more equitable growth. So it really worries me that the new government is now in coalition and almost nothing has changed in terms of its key ministries, right? And this is a problem because, like you mentioned, they like flashy things. And the big things this government did over the last 10 years was things like overnight demonetization, overnight the introduction of the goods and services tax, right? All of these had sort of calamitous outcomes on small and micro enterprises across India, leading to these groups really suffering, which is surprising because these are traditionally very pro-BJP groups in India. You know, your local small businessman loves the BJP as a long-time party focused on business interests, which has been a bit of a catastrophe for the government. So I think what is really happening in India is not just inequality on a broad scale, it is regional inequality that's growing. So if you look at the big success stories in India right now, they're coming from Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Gujarat. Now, how many of those are entirely BJP states? Some, but in those states, the governments are doing something very different from what the national BJP government wants from them. So I think one thing to watch is how much is this government actually listening to states that are doing a bang-up job of actually producing jobs and more equitable growth. The second thing that's happening is the demographic dividend is also occurring on a regional scale. So states that are developing are now more aging populations because they have actually curtailed their birth rates, right? So if you look at a state like Tamil Nadu, it's become a hub for migrants from the north. And they're coming from the north of India to find jobs in Tamil Nadu because Tamil Nadu's population is sort of becoming more skilled and not wanting to do labor-related jobs. So how much is the government actually going to lean into that and accept that we need a very dynamic, internally migration-oriented population that can take advantage of these regional inequalities and growth? Again, a difficult task because the states like these have very different political power bases, are run by regional parties relative to the national government. So look, I'm hoping that the results scared the government, that they will actually embark on a different set of developmental goals, but nothing is revealing right now in terms of making investment or manufacturing numbers budge. And the big elephant in the room is stagnating agrarian economies. There has been no interest in reviving India's agricultural sector and sort of understanding that most Indians live in their villages and are still very attached to their communities and their land. So what are we doing to really introduce some dynamism in the agrarian sector of the economy is still being relatively untouched, right?
Yeah, if I might just briefly add to that, I think a couple of points. First, the phrase jobless growth came up, and I think this has been the story of India's growth over the last 30 years, that we have headline growth rates which look pretty good compared to the rest of the world, certainly compared to what India had in the past. But it hasn't generated large-scale employment. And what it has also led to is a huge increase in relative poverty. So people may be getting better off, but people are less better off than their betters to a much greater extent. And this has an effect, political consequences in terms of social stability, in terms of discontent. It feeds into what was alluded to in terms of caste, the caste factor in politics, and backward class and depressed caste groups, scheduled caste groups being disadvantaged in particular. So there is that, and that has been a problem that has existed before the BJP was in power in the last decade, and it continues now. And nothing is being addressed. Nothing is being done to address that by this new government, up till now anyway. The other point that I wanted to raise in relation to this is about the differential growth rates. That it's not just in terms of economic growth, but in terms of development indicators, there is a huge gulf between a state like Kerala, which I come from, which has human development indicators and life expectancy, which is comparable to many upper middle income states, even though it is not a rich state. While you have a state like Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, where you have the indicators are close to some of the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So, and these are huge gulfs, and nothing is tangible. And in terms of a central government setting national targets, one of the problems is that national targets, the latest national targets that have been set in a whole range of activities are actually targets that states like Kerala or Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra have reached some time ago. So that is actually holding them back. So there needs to be a real long-term view of how do you deal with these kinds of issues. And the BJP itself has changed as a party, is that yes, the Jan Sangh used to be a party of small businessmen and traders and so on in urban areas in North India. But now it is a party backed by the biggest Indian corporates, especially people are aware of the association of Gautam Adani with the BJP since his time as a businessman in Gujarat. So I think there are, in the Indian economy, I always feel is like it's on shifting sands. I mean, it is not a stable economy despite its growth rates.
Yeah, I mean, just to add my 2 cents, I think we're talking about, the 2 Ds here are disparity and demography. So on the disparity issue, I mean, I often think India is less comparable to China and more to the European Union. We've heard here, like, the level of disparity that we see across India's 28 states is significant. So we're not just talking about an urban-rural divide, we're talking about a divide between India's more prosperous south and the more populous north, between those that are working in India's famed IT sector, which is a very small proportion of India's overall workforce, between those that are working in the formal economy and the much larger proportion of the workforce in the informal economy, that those that are working for the large conglomerates, the Tatas, the Adanis, and the Reliances, and then those that are working in startups and SMEs that are struggling to a larger degree. So I think that's the one issue, the disparity issue. The demography issue, I think, we've all heard over the last year, India has been touted as the world's most populous country, having recently surpassed China. But there's a very real risk of this demographic dividend becoming a demographic burden in the absence of sufficient investment in employment generation, skills development. And I think the BJP has recognized this. The latest budget announced 5 employment-related schemes, including one which was supposed to provide a 12-month paid internship to 10 million young people. Now, I mean, I think we can debate to the extent to which these are just quick fixes or will actually be successful. But I think there is at least recognition that this is a challenge facing the Indian economy.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I'll just open it up. So if you could just raise your hand, and then we'll take questions of 3, and then give our panelists a chance to respond. Okay, so I see these 2. So black shirt, and then the white sweater. Okay, so do you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Hiya. So as you guys know, that in India there's a lot of Islamophobia with the BJP government. And there's a lot of hatred towards the Jammu and Kashmir region. So in spite of the election result, what do you think is going to happen in the next couple of years with how the Modi government is going to act towards Muslims and the region of Kashmir?
Great, thank you so much. And then I should have mentioned this, but feel free to introduce yourself before you ask your question.
Hi, my name's Mustafa, and I'm a democracy and comparative politics student at UCL.
Thank you. Then right behind you, yeah.
Hi, I'm Shafali, and I work in financial services. I just wanted 2 questions, actually. One to do with, I'm interested to hear the panel's view on the disparities between the states. Can you just add a bit more colour to what the differences are? What do you see as the kind of challenges? Why is there such disparity between, let's say, Kerala versus Bihar? Just if you can add a bit more colour to that. Secondly, from a business point of view, what are your views on kind of the FTA agreement, UK, India? Where do you see that going? If you can just add a bit more colour to that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And then I think I saw your hand.
Hi, I'm Yuan. I'm a lecturer here at UCL Institute of Global Prosperity. So I actually did my fieldwork, my PhD on China-Indian comparative studies. When I was studying, I did my PhD here in the UK. which gives me the opportunity really to study India in depth. And I also traveled, lived 2 years in India, lived in Bihar villages because I was doing poverty-related projects. But that feels like a completely different world now. And since I think the pandemic 4 or 5 years ago, no Chinese, I think, are able to travel as long as you hold a Chinese passport. You're not be able to travel to India, so no tourists travel, no business. Even if you are married to an Indian family, as a family you can't even get a family visa, not to mention research visa of any kind. So according to, I think, the Chinese embassy's latest calculation, there are all around India, there are only 15 Chinese students studying India. So this kind of a ban really had a great impact, because before that, when I was doing my fieldwork in India, there were Chinese mobile phone companies, Chinese white house appliances companies operating in India. There were people who study the Indian Hindi language, and they run a consultancy like in Delhi, where they help Chinese business to set up companies and to operate in India. But that has completely come to an end now, and all the Chinese who has been dispatched to India has now come back. So I was wondering, I think my question is probably more related to your field in terms of international policy. I can't believe it is because of the border dispute since the 2020s that has caused this situation, because China-India war since 1967 has led to almost 20 years of contact between the two countries. And since the late 80s, 90s, the relationships started to warm up. It's getting better. And kind of had a honeymoon stage where we say in Hindi, chini bhai bhai, that slogan came back again. And there's a lot of academic exchanges as well. But then it suddenly came to an end. And I feel the border dispute is just an excuse. And I still can't find a valid reason to understand why. Because China and India, they are neighbors, and these are huge countries, and it's just so unreasonable not to have any contact.
Okay, great, thank you so much. And then, do we want to just go around and you want to pick up the questions? Do you want to go in the order of the question? Sure. Yeah, should we give first question? And on Islamophobia?
Yeah, I mean, shall we respond to all the questions or just one question each?
Maybe we'll do question by question. Would that be more categorical?
Okay, so you would like me to respond on Muslims and Kashmir?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the points that, of course, in terms of the BJP and Hindu nationalism more generally, is that it has in the past used the various communal stereotypes when it comes to Muslims in India. And remember, Muslims are more than 200 million people in India. So, in fact, the Muslims are, India is the third largest Muslim country in the world. Yet there is not a single Muslim member of parliament from the ruling party. There is, let alone a minister, which is the first time ever in the history of independent India. So it is a very strange situation that you have, and it has been part of the sort of basic discourse of the BJP, the anxieties about Muslim growth rates, fertility, illegal migration from Bangladesh, so on. And then there is also all these issues like the idea of love jihad, the idea that Muslim men were marrying Hindu women in order to, as part of a general Islamization of the Indian population. And of course, the actions by cow protectors, Gaurakshas, to stop the killing of cows and the targeting of Muslims as people who are doing this. And there have been 50 people who have been lynched, at least 50 to 70 in the last 10 years in different parts of India. So, and all of this does feed through to the idea that the Indian identity is basically a Hindu identity, where other groups, non-Hindus, are present within that on the basis that they accept that India is a Hindu country, even though it has a constitution which is broadly secular. So, and I don't think that is going to change. I mean, your question was whether we thought that this was what was going to happen in the next few years. Certainly under this BJP government, I don't see anything changing dramatically. Now, because that is part of the basic discourse. And I think it has also affected what I said earlier about the common sense of India, is that over time, the legitimization of this official discourse has changed the way how people think. I mean, in ordinary conversation, and not just people talk a bit differently than they did 10, 15, 20 years ago. People are much more upfront about voicing misgivings about Muslims. So that's on that. I don't see much change. It's in the next few years. About Kashmir, well, of course, we have just had elections in Kashmir, which is now no longer a state but a union territory. It was downgraded as part of the 2019 revocation of Article 370 of the Constitution. And the opposition to the BJP, the Regional National Conference and the Congress, won fairly convincingly. How much that how much power that government will have and how much it will be able to do is yet to be seen, because the powers of the lieutenant governor, the administrator appointed by India, have been strengthened under the post-2019 dispensation. So, but yes, the fact that Kashmir now has an elected assembly and an elected government is a step forward. And the elections did produce a turnout of over 60%. So people did feel that it was worth voting. So that might be, there's a chink of light, but no more than that.
Great, thank you so much. Did you want to add anything on that or move on to the second question? Okay, so I think the second question is about the regional differences between Indian states and then also the implications of the new free trade agreement.
Maybe I'll take the regional differences. I mean, I come from the south of India, I come from Tamil Nadu, and it's remarkable how much the Hindu-Muslim dynamic is not a thing in my state. And the BJP has really tried to make it a thing in the state by playing to communal sentiments in districts like Kanyakumari and Coimbatore in election after election. And yet it has not managed to make a dent, right? And so I think some of the roots of regional disparities go back to the colonial era. You know, places where the British, in conjunction with local notables, built greater state capacity and infrastructure with sort of a deep root, but also politics of a regional variety that took shape even during colonialism. So places like Tamil Nadu and the Bombay Presidency, which went on to become Maharashtra, and West Bengal, which was then the Bengal Presidency, started to have pretty robust party politics, even as early as the 1920s and 1930s. So some of these states ran ahead after independence. So you could see sort of regional disparities develop in the post-independence period in terms of human capital investments, completely unique party systems and political parties that are very tied to local state-level interests, and a sort of refusal to nationalize the politics, right? And political parties have really tried in places like Tamil Nadu to nationalize politics. They've been more successful in some parts of the country than others. West Bengal was communist for over 50 years, right? And the BJP has made successful inroads there in a way that it's not able to do in the South. So I think some of the recipe for regional disparities comes from very different ethnic makeup, party system makeup, and welfare status orientation that differs, by region. And so I never worry if say the DMK loses and the AIA DMK comes into power, whether citizens will lose welfare benefits in Tamil Nadu, because I know broadly the two parties agree on what welfare politics means in the state. That's a big worry when Uttar Pradesh changes government from Samajwadi to BSP to BJP, because the governments have wildly different agendas on whom they're helping and what kind of politics they want to do. And that makes a huge difference to how citizens approach politics in these states, right? And it also connects to the point on the sense of Muslim well-being in India or lower caste well-being. States are very different in how much citizens feel secure in their identity and how much politics is either helping or not helping them.
So on the UK-India FTA, so the current status, and I'm not part of obviously the negotiating team, so I don't have the inside scoop on this, but there have been 14 rounds of negotiation. I believe consensus has been reached on most of the 26 chapters. It's a priority for both governments. So I think, don't quote me on this, but I'm hoping that it'll be concluded before the end of this year. There are several outstanding issues: visa and mobility rules for skilled Indian professionals, national insurance contributions by Indian workers who are on inter-company transfers, improved UK access for goods and services. But I think this needs to be put in a broader context. I mean, India is it's inherently protectionist at its roots. So if you look at, for example, India is not part of any of the key multilateral trade initiatives in Asia. It exited RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, in 2019. It's not part of the trade pillar of IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It didn't join the CPTPP, that's the successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It has discontinued or most of bilateral investment treaties just under a decade ago. Average tariff levels have actually gone up over time. So this is why it's been such a difficult process in concluding the FTA. Just more broadly, in terms of the India-UK relationship, we can see that the Labour government has prioritized that relationship. Foreign Secretary David Lammy traveled to India within his first month in office. But I think Indian External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, he really described it best. When he was here last Diwali, he made remarks in which he noted the quote-unquote unrealized potential of the India-UK relationship and the need to seek new convergences. And that means moving beyond long-standing historical linkages of a common language and legal system to find new areas of cooperation. So whether it be in defense, technology space, the energy transition, arguably, even in Europe, the UK is not India's key strategic partner, it's France. So I think there is room for improvement in that relationship.
Thank you.
And you want me to comment on the China?
That was the China-India cooperation.
On the China issue, and that's an issue of particular interest. I grew up in Hong Kong, so I'm quite interested in India-China relations. So recently we saw the Chinese ambassador to India making a statement saying that he wants to see a resumption of direct flights between Beijing and New Delhi, and he wants to see a sort of streamlining of the visa approval process. So clearly there are challenges in the relationship. I think the relationship has been in a new normal since 2020, when we saw the Galwan Valley border clashes. What existed from 1988 to 2019, which is where both sides agreed, let's shelve the border dispute and work on other aspects of that relationship. I think that ship has sailed, at least on the New Delhi's part. I think Beijing would like to move back to that pre-2020 status quo. But I think you're completely right that the border dispute is merely a symptom of a broader geopolitical rivalry between both countries. This attempt, both countries want to be seen, as I say, a voice of the global South. They want to be seen as playing a leadership role in Asia and in global geopolitics. So I think that has been a hindrance to the bilateral relationship. So beyond, the 1962 border conflict, the fact that India is the only South Asian country which has not supported or endorsed China's Belt and Road Initiative. President Xi Jinping didn't attend the G20 summit last year when India was hosting. You can see several examples on issues of global governance where both countries are essentially competing with each other. So I think that is, I think, a larger issue. So frankly, I think even if the border dispute was resolved, that geopolitical rivalry would continue in the relationship. But that being said, I think one point to keep in mind is China is India's leading trade partner. And I think as India becomes increasingly important to global supply chains, it's going to become more, not less, dependent on China. So whether, from the pharmaceutical sector to electric vehicles, key components are being sourced from China. So it remains the elephant in the room. So it's a relationship that cannot be severed. There are going to be frictions in it, undoubtedly, as you've alluded to. But I think it goes beyond the border dispute, as you mentioned.
I just want to say one thing, because you mentioned the issue of very few students even studying in India anymore, or research visas being cancelled. This is a phenomenon beyond China. It has become very hard for foreign scholars to do work in India and to procure that very, elusive research visa. Scholars I know in political science who work in the United States and UK, who have long had research visas, have just been refused them, even though they don't work on anything controversial that could in any way, upset the current government. So I think there's just been a sort of secular rise in mistrust against foreign scholars, and also a disincentivizing of inviting foreign scholars to speak at universities. Like, there's a huge bureaucratic hurdle to jump if you want to have somebody from a foreign institution speak at your domestic university proceedings, if you're taking government money in any way. And even if you're not, you have to let the government know what they're going to be talking about. So in general, I think, beyond China, there's been a rise in suspicion of foreign academic scholarship in India. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So I'll just take a round of questions. So I think we have you, and then, so I'll take these three, and then I'll put you in the next round.
Not a question, if I might just say. Yes, maybe there's a resistance, except if it's Israel. Because the Indian Institute of Science had, you must know the recent controversy, apart from the question.
Okay, sounds good. So a comment. So then I can take these three. Sorry, it was, please go ahead.
BRICS has been quite an important part. What's actually happening with BRICS, especially in relation to China, but with politics changing, is BRICS going to change, expand, as far as India is concerned, or not?
Great, thank you. And then
I actually did have a question about BRICS.
Okay.
No worries. I do have another question regarding media within India. I think in the last few years we've seen a lot of difficulty for journalism and the whole concept of freedom of speech. And I think it's being tampered, and I've seen a lot of personal evidence from it as well. So I'm just curious to know what you think is going to happen post-election. Do you see a change within that? Or is there a way in which it could get better? Or is it just going to stay the same?
Great, thank you. Then I think you had a question, right?
I wanted to actually reiterate what Sarah said regarding the neighbors issue. How you think the new government would look into make India have a footing in the global stage without having any friendly neighbor in its side.
Okay. Excellent. Should we start with the BRICS question?
So on the BRICS question, so I think there's a degree of irrational exuberance associated with the BRICS. One thing that we need to remember, it doesn't have any permanent secretariat. It has a very weak institutional structure, so you can't really compare it with the IMF or the World Bank or NATO. I think so. That's one point. The other point to note: there's a lack of consensus over what does the BRICS actually stand for. Among its core member states or original member states, the BRIC, the BRIC, excluding South Africa, Brazil and India, I think, are more focused on the economic dimensions of BRICS. Whereas a country like China, I think it sees it through a more ideological lens as a means of promoting its global development, global civilization, global security initiatives, while Russia sees it as a means to engage with the world as it's been isolated in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine. And it's also interesting to see who hasn't joined the BRICS. Indonesia pulled back from its initial interest in joining last year. And other countries, Mexico, for instance, I think there's a concern that BRICS is increasingly turns into some sort of anti-Western forum. And in that context, I think India will be increasingly estranged or the odd man out, because as I said, it wants to promote a non-Western worldview, but not an anti-Western worldview. So I think there are a lot of fissures and points of friction within the BRICS architecture. And it also, as I said, is still an organization which is very much in its infancy. Although, I mean, it has this broad consensus that we want to promote a more equitable distribution of power in the international, in a multipolar international system. There's been talk about the de-dollarization of trade, but again, these are, very broad statements. So the statements, I think, outweighs the substance in terms of what's been accomplished.
Great, thank you. I think the second, or did you want to, go ahead, please.
If I tackle the question on the media,
Yeah.
I think many of you may be aware of the way in which media in India has changed over the last 10 years, and especially with the fact that it has become much more of a monopoly of very few actors. And the last the last English language television channel, NDTV, that had a relatively independent stance when it came to reporting politics in India, was acquired by the Adani Group, which has strong ties, as I mentioned previously, with the BJP a couple of years ago. Now, the one thing that has happened, though, with the election and since, is I think many of the election results themselves have sort of relaxed the leashes on some of these television stations in particular in how they report. That perhaps the fact that the results of the elections were such a surprise, that the BJP didn't win a majority on its own, meant that there was a more of an effort to present other sides to a story, rather than just rely on the government or the dominant line. So I think that there's sort of some straws in the wind that is happening with some of the otherwise rather univocal media environment, certainly when it comes to television. The press is much more of a mixed bag, especially when it comes to the regional press, where you still have a lot of newspapers and media that present a whole range of different views, and also. And even with the English language press, you have, and this is not to mention, of course, all the online sources of news like The Wire or The Caravan or Scroll India, and a whole range of different regional language channels online that present a huge variety of views. So I think it's not all it's a story where I think we could see perhaps some recrudescence of more press, if not freedom, at least liberalization to a degree, though it's not what I'm sure the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting would like.
I just want to add, though, that Indian media environment has never been that free, right? Even under previous governments, there have been leashes on leading newspapers and TV channels. And what really broke out in the last few decades was the opportunity for regional states to have their own TV channels, a real increase in the printed vernacular press. And I think in the last few years, we missed a lot of what these elections were going to be about, because most of our news was coming from these few news channels that spoke the BJP's. But if you were reading, Hindi vernacular press or any of the regional presses, you would have gotten the hint of what was happening on the ground. And I think this has been a real breakout moment for social media-led news, right? A lot of Indians now get their news through online sources in a way that is not easily controllable by governments, not just at the national, but also at the regional level. And that, I don't know what they're going to do. Whether this moment of having news reach people in such a new way is going to be a moment of more curtailing of a different kind of media, which they don't yet understand fully. They're trying their, best. And I just want to point out that BJP has just done this to an art, but it has always existed. There is a sort of semi-authoritarian mindset in a lot of regional governments, even that in the states that I spoke so highly of, like Tamil Nadu. The chief minister there will not like it if you're making posts or covering news in a dramatically negative way. There are limits. It does not resemble the open media environment of many Western countries.
Great, thank you. And then I think a final question for Kshitij about the relationship with neighbors.
Yeah, the relationship with neighbors. So I think there is a connection between India's neighborhood policy and its global aspirations. I mean, I think when we talk about China, we tend to forget that China regionalized before it globalized by integrating its economy and infrastructure with neighboring countries, and that helped to cement its centrality to global supply chains and transnational production networks. If you look at South Asia, it has the lowest level of economic integration among all regions. Intra-regional trade is 5% of the region's total trade. And compare that with, say, Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, where it's 25%. The region's institutional architecture is severely underutilized and underdeveloped. So SARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, it hasn't held a summit meeting since 2015, I believe, and many will attribute that to the difficult India-Pakistan relationship. But even if you look at other forums like BIMSTEC is another regional forum which excludes Pakistan. It's only held 5 summit meetings since it was set up in 1997. So you have a severely underdeveloped institutional architecture, low levels of intra-regional trade. The Modi government has invested a lot of time, money, and energy in improving physical and digital infrastructure connectivity within India. But I think the same needs to be done within the region more broadly if India is supposed to meet its these global aspirations that it has.
Excellent, thank you. So I think we have time for one more round of 3 questions. Okay, so I have 1, then 2, then 3. Okay. So please go ahead in the back.
So my name is Jishnu. There is a perception on Indian election that every time the electorate are really making the BJP or the Hindutva far right makes the wins. But if you clearly see the election results, you can see in the farmers' belt, BJP has continuously lost the votes, but they could secure votes from other places, though their still vote are almost intact. So I would like to know the perception on the academical stereotyping criticism on Indian people, Indian working class, working poor, that they are always in favor of BJP. I would like to know your perception on it. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I think Azir.
It's interesting the media question, but from a lens of foreign media. So we understand the context of domestic media, but for outsiders, if we're trying to understand what's going on in India, do my Indian friends say that Western media coverage can be quite biased sometimes in terms of the headlines, political and economic coverage. So it's a practical question. Which sources in English language would you recommend for us to consume to try and understand better, perhaps from an Indian perspective?
Thank you. And then your question.
My name is Kalyan, and I'm an international student. I come from India, part South India, Hyderabad. So I'm from London School of Economics. So as states like Kerala, where James Chiriyankandath has come from, Tamil Nadu, where Pavithra Ma'am is coming from, haven't showed any effects of BJP. So these areas aren't ruled by BJP. As Pavithra Ma'am said, that there's a lot of internal migration which is happening from the northern states, coming from the southern states for jobs and other type of systems. So both countries, they don't show any type of lineage towards regional, religions. So not Hindutva, not Muslim, not Christian. So these two states, they don't show any type of religion, these things. So how does the BJP at center see this? So do you think these governments which are not aligning to any religion are doing much better than the north countries? So because I come from India, because I know what a religion and a caste-based politics are, because in Hyderabad you have a lot of Muslims, so all the Muslim community goes for Muslims, so all Hindu communities go for Muslims. Whereas in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, these two governments, they don't care, are not aligned to any type of religions or castes. So, but they are doing very good in terms of development and etc. Whereas the the BJP governments in other states are doing far less better than these countries. So, how does BJP at the center see this after this elections?
Great. Thank you. Okay, so I think the first question was sort of on voting behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I work on voting for the BJP, and it's very clear that BJP gets very consistent support from wealthy and upper caste voters. They are a very resilient bloc for the BJP, and a bloc that will not be moved from election cycle to election cycle. Some of India's most persuadable voters are poor voters. And in fact, they're some of the most neglected voters, regardless of what party is in power. So in case you're really interested in how India's poor vote, there's some terrific new research out by Francesca Jensenius and Pradeep Chibber, who have a book manuscript in progress on how India's parties, regardless of the Congress or the BJP, ignore poor voters because they have locked themselves in a very ethnic model of voting where they work through intermediaries who allow them to reach specific caste or religious constituents, but those then proceed to ignore the most marginal amongst those groups. So India's poor voters will turn out in very high numbers on election day, but then find themselves somewhat neglected by parties regardless of who comes into power. So we really should dispel this notion that the poorest of India's voters are stalwart BJP supporters. They really are not. And this election, in fact, demonstrates that once they figured out that the economy wasn't working for them, they tried something new, rather than being ideologically wedded to a party, because their economic interests are much more insecure. Right? And so I really do think at least political science, empirical research is not giving any sort of wind to this idea.
Great, thank you. Then I think the other question was about Western media biases and how they kind of cover Indian politics. I don't know if anyone wants to.
And I think the question was really about what media you should
about sources,
right?
Yeah.
Sources. What would we trust to give us accurate pictures? What would you trust, James?
Well, I mentioned several online media like Scroll India, The Wire, because I think you referred especially to English language ones. And also you have to subscribe, but you can take a subscription to the Hindu or the Indian Express. I mean, I tend to read about half a dozen different online sources as well as Kerala sources. Every morning, just skim through them, so you have a broad picture. But I would say The Wire, Scroll, Caravan, The Hindu, Indian Express would be good starters. And
I would also throw the Times of India in there because, you know, if your political allegiances are to the right, Times of India is very popular. If your political allegiance is to the left, the Hindu is very popular. Everybody agrees the Express is fine, right? And so if you also want to get a range of how Indian newspapers are covering the exact same issue, and those ideological differences matter to you, that's something you could read.
If I could just press on the point of Western media, the reason I raise it is because, for example, The Economist had a very strong series before the Indian election, which generated a lot of online discussion among Indian nationals and Indians overseas about coverage of India. So I'm just curious about your views on maybe some of the top tier Western media. Like, do you think it's generally, I mean, obviously we should consume different sources, right? But do you think it's an objective balance covering India, or do you feel there is some kind of bias just because, you know, beyond Indian media we also consume Western media, which also informs, I think, many people's views of countries that are not our own?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that there is there are so many rich sources of information in Indian English media makes that if you are really interested in India, I think you should go to them first. I mean, occasionally you would have, I think some of the Economist pieces have been good. Some of them have over-egged the Indian pudding in the past in terms of the economy and so on. But I think, I would say start with, if you're really interested in India, start with the Indian English media. I thought, shall I just go on to the how the BJP sees Kerala and Tamil Nadu and so on? first point I would make is that it's not that political parties in Kerala or Tamil Nadu ignore caste and religion. They take account of it very much when it comes to electoral calculations and so on. But it goes back to, as Pavithra has said, a history of a different form of communal accommodation. So how Hindus, different Hindu groups, Christians, Muslims are brought into the political system. And that has happened over decades. And of course, it has happened through the exercise of social reform movements for much of the past century. In the Dravidian movement, in the self-respect movement in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, with the social reform movements among the Uva and Nair castes, among Christians as well, among Muslims as well. So all those movements produced, and they also produced in Kerala, the Communist Party came largely out of those actually religious reform movements, ironically. So I think they do take account of it. The BJP has tried very hard, as Pavithra also mentioned, to try to break through. Now, it did manage for the first time in this last election to win one seat in Thrissur, which is actually the district my family comes from. And one of the reasons they did that was that first they had a candidate who was atypical, because he was a popular film star and so on. He had a local bond and so on. The other thing was they also exploited a section of the Christian community and who have been quoted by the BJP. Their bishops have been quoted by the BJP. Their television stations and so on have been patronized. And to stir a communal aspect to it, the Christian-Muslim tensions. And with one or two stories which were planted of, which had emerged of Muslim or Christian girls who had, or women who had married Muslims, and the story spread that they had ended up in Afghanistan and joined the Taliban. And that became a huge thing. And even a film was made of it. So, and the other point is where the BJP has, certainly in Kerala, they have sought to make some gains, is in areas which are major temple centers. Now, Thrissur is, Guruvayur is nearby. If you go to Kanyakumari, you have the Vivekananda Rock and the whole, which is old RSS's main center, the Vivekananda Kendra on Vivekananda Rock and at Kanyakumari. So, but they have had only limited success because as I said, the patterns of politics, the history, and of course language and culture, because now it is changing, but for many years the BJP was regarded as an almost a foreign force, that they are not part of the politics of this state. They have come from somewhere else. That's not true now, but that has long been the case.
So you mean that people of Tamil Nadu and Kerala have accepted BJP? That is your last statement?
No, I'm saying that now there are many, they have increased their membership. The fact that the BJP has been in government for the last 10 years, that of course changes things on the ground. So the BJP is not seen as much an outsider as it used to be before.
But in whole India, if your number of vote, not the, if you see, that is the largest one. So it means a majority accepted the BJP. number of votes. You don't compare the who win, because 100 political party, 100 person joined together against one party. That is obvious.
We are
But
completely
majority
accepting
of
that they
voters
won
have
a
accepted.
plurality of the vote.
They have
They did
never won
not
a
get
majority.
anywhere near a majority.
It's
They
about
won
to.
a little over 1/3 of the vote in India.
But one
that's a
single
plurality.
party has got the highest number of votes.
Okay, so
That we have to appreciate. And that continuously, the third terms, they are being selected.
well, I think we need to, we're kind of out of time, so we can maybe continue the discussion later. Okay, so please join me in thanking the speakers. It's a fascinating discussion. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for the questions and being such an engaged audience. And so what I wanted to note is, so our next policy and practice event will be in this room next Thursday on October 24th. And this is a part of a new mini-series on priorities for the UK government, and the first one will focus on economic growth. So hope to see you there, and then please follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is UCLSPP. And thank you all again, and thank you to our speakers. Bye.